to get us going, talking about how it has been reporting the Westminster Parliament in lockdown. And I'm genuinely fascinated to hear what he's got to say.
Well, thanks, Meg. I think what's remarkable about this is just the sheer weirdness. Having done this job for a fairly long time now, you interact in a very informal way. I tend to lurk around the coffee bars in Portcullis House. It's amazing how vulnerable members of Parliament are before they've had their first caffeine shot of the morning. And there's an element of randomness there. You bump into someone in a queue, you strike up a conversation, you learn something you didn't know was going on. And that kind of thing no longer happens. Everything is now routed through a kind of digital straitjacket, if you like. I'm mixing my metaphors horribly, but all the critical relationships of Parliament. So you're talking about MPs and MPs, government and MPs indeed, and the general public mostly, and of course the press and MPs. You don't have these random conversations where you bump into someone anymore. Everything has to be done by picking up a phone or sending an email or having a Snapchat or whatever it is to get in touch with people. So the whole thing has therefore becomes a great deal more formalized and more scripted, just as in the chamber. There's no sense of randomness about questions to ministers anymore. There's a very clear batting order, a published batting order, and there's very little chance for the person in the chair to sort of sense that something's boiling up and suddenly decide to call someone from a particular sector of the Conservative backbenches or whatever it is. So you have this whole thing squeezed into an unusual and rather uncomfortable shape as a result. And that's set against a number of other factors here. I'll return in a minute to there's a very interesting question about MPs and the general public. We're in a situation that's completely unprecedented. There's a great deal of fear and anger, I think, kicking around in the general public mood. But MPs are mostly having to sense that through social media. And there's a question in my mind about the extent to which actually it's all being amplified, because that's the only method people have got for sort of canvassing mass opinion. There isn't an easy way anymore for people to sort of just go out on the streets and vox pop and talk to random voters without getting caught by the lockdown rules. So I just wonder if the sort of much remarked upon social media echo chamber effect is being vastly amplified, because it's almost the only thing a lot of parliamentarians and politicians have now with which to try and sense a public mood. And they must be sniffing the air, because these are such unprecedented times and things are changing so fast that that's the mechanism they must, I'm sure, inevitably be falling back upon. So I think that informs a certain amount of what goes on in Parliament. Then you have the nature of the business in the chamber itself. I mean, as I say, everything seems to be a great deal more scripted, and MPs don't have this chance for informal contact with one another, sitting in the tea room, chatting in the lobby in anything like the same way. To be sure, there are now very long queues to vote that take quite a while. But when you're standing a metre or a couple of metres apart in a very public place surrounded by random colleagues, it's hardly conducive to the kind of plotting that might have gone on in slightly different circumstances. So that's changed the nature of the beast as well. Watching all this from afar, because I basically have almost never been into the Palace of Westminster during the lockdown. I had one visit there to conduct a properly socially distanced interview with the aid of a 3-metre-long cable with a microphone on the end of it. But watching from afar, you get a completely different sense of proceedings than you would if you were sitting in the chamber. In some ways, it's not entirely about it. If you're watching, for example, a select committee where there's a witness, you're seeing the witness's face in a full frame screen, so you can see every sort of twitch, grimace and wince as they're giving evidence in a way that you probably wouldn't even if you were in the committee room. So in some ways it can be almost a more sort of intimate experience watching people in action. So that side of things is very important. And just a final thought, really. The gross tonnage of news coming out of Parliament at the moment is absolutely huge. There is just, this week we've had Hong Kong, and almost as we speak, they're doing what's going to happen with schools. These are issues of vast public interest. And there's a great deal of public viewing going on. I mean, BBC Parliament, they tell me, is back up to the sort of levels seen at the climax of the Brexit dramas last year, which doesn't surprise me at all, because a lot of people just want to watch this stuff straight and unmediated. I could go on about the way that both the houses have got into their own tangles over things like voting methods and so forth, but they now seem to have settled down into a standard way of business, and I better not drone on too long about that. But that does add a sort of slight comic element to the whole thing, watching people unfamiliar with technology grappling with it. But I better leave it there.
Mark, thank you so much. You're being terribly disciplined sticking to time there, and there's so much more fascinating stuff lying behind that I can't wait to ask you about and hear other members of the audience ask you about. But let's move over now to Brian in Scotland, where many of the members of the audience may be more familiar with what's been going on in Westminster. It's been very heavily reported in the national and indeed international newspapers with respect to some of the more comic elements that Mark was referring to. Obviously, we will have people here from Scotland as well, but give us some contrasts, similarities and differences. What struck you most, Brian, in this period?
Thanks very much indeed, Meg. I generally regard political reporting as being a source of innocent merriment, so I'm I was enjoying Mark's description there of the difficulties. I've covered Scottish politics since Braveheart was a boy, but actually way back in the Middle Ages, I was a lobby corps in Westminster for 6 years during Margaret Thatcher's first and second term, so able perhaps to compare and contrast. I think Holyrood has coped reasonably well with the impact of this hideous plague, but like as Mark describes there, it has been transformed. I mean, news events generally in Scotland these days, the news source, the primary news source is the daily news conferences held by the First Minister. Nicola Sturgeon has opted to lead every single one, despite the demands on her time and her occasional evident exasperation at the tendentious questions from the wicked media. But the Holyrood's seemed to be a bit usurped for a spell, but particularly of late. The Scottish Parliament has fought back. MSPs have asserted their position in the discourse, and they've been actively assisted by the presiding officer, Ken McIntosh. A statement at the end of April, he said that the core and continuing purpose of the Scottish Parliament was to continue to function and scrutinise the government's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, I should stress he meant the Scottish government on that one, although Boris Johnson's pronouncements are always of interest in Scotland as well. But what he wanted, he said Holyrood applied itself with alacrity to the challenge of playing its part. Basically, they were fighting back into the game. So first of all, he wanted a forum for MSPs to ventilate concerns raised with them frankly in a veritable flood by their constituents. Secondly, he wanted continuing scrutiny of ministerial actions beyond the questions posed by the media. It wasn't entirely competitive, but it certainly was a bit. So Nicola Sturgeon has found herself delivering the most significant statements at Holyrood rather than in St Andrew's House, and that alters the nature of the event for us in the media. It means she's more constrained, she's facing political questions, and indeed of late has had to contemplate a very partisan agenda rather than media concerns. Now, I believe that Holyrood, I think, has adapted more readily to virtual discourse than has the Palace of Westminster. It's understandable. Holyrood was always intended to be somewhat family friendly, working day hours, digital voting, etc. But the change has been far from easy. Discussion in the chamber, as Mark described there, and especially in committee, has become stilted and orchestrated. There's relatively little room for substantial cross-examination, and therefore there's relatively little room for the sort of stuff that makes for the media. Now, there have been exceptions. Alec Neil, MSP, former SNP Cabinet Secretary, found time to attack the previous plans for blended schooling in Scotland. He was ostensibly attacking the councils, but everyone knew it was aimed at his own former colleagues in government, and that was a strong story for us. But mostly committee members, MSPs, they plough through their allotted quota of questions and speeches, and for the watching media, it can be rather dull because we like the stories arise when conventional wisdom is contested by determined, well-informed MSPs or witnesses, and when the MSP has to wait for the computer to switch on her vision, and then she has to switch on the audio, and that's when the system works at all. The buzz is just not quite there, although I readily understand the need for these matters. One other big change over the period of lockdown. At the start, there was an evident search for consensus between the political parties. It was almost choreographed. You know, basically it was almost choreographed. Nicola Sturgeon was pretty well aware what Jackson Carlaw and Richard Leonard and the others were likely to raise, and they raised it in a way of a supportive fashion. That has changed, particularly for the Tories. That has completely changed. Conservatives, of course, the principal party of opposition at Holyrood, and they are really playing that role. After a relatively brief period of that COVID consensus, Jackson Carlaw is back in the combative mode. He accuses the First Minister of causing COVID chaos over testing, care homes, education, the economy, travel plans, everything, opening the pubs, the whole bit. Now, this presents something of a dilemma to the media. Mark mentioned that there is huge public interest in the pronouncements in Parliament and the pronouncements of ministers, and there is. Jackson Carlaw's comments are newsworthy and absolutely merit reporting, as do Nicola Sturgeon's blunt replies. But the snag is, well, not the snag, but the issue is that our audiences are still primarily hungry for factual information about the virus itself, rather than the political knockabout. They are tuning in. Mark mentioned the Parliament channel. We cover the Nicola Sturgeon's news briefings live on television every day. BBC One, BBC Scotland channel, radio, online, and it gets incredible audiences, absolutely massive audience. Now, we've chosen to continue with live coverage of that while still covering the political argument as well. But I agree with Mark on one thing, is the intangible change in politics. We've lost our conversational contact with MSPs, ministers, advisors. We chose, I mean, I was, as I said, a lobby corps for 6 years. We chose not to replicate the lobby system. We allow all accredited journalists to cover the Scottish Parliament, whether they're from the Times of London, the Evening Times of Glasgow, or the Oban Times. It became known as the Oban Times question. But there are still regulars, the political journalists who hang around the place, who gossip in the coffee bar or Margot's bar in the evening, and in the garden lobby, which is the core of Parliament, originally intended as a corridor, but you know, there's nothing straightforward in the Scottish Parliament. So it's become the core, and that's gone. And that's made a huge difference to the nature of the media coverage. But I think it's also changed the discourse in Parliament. It is more staid, it is more static, it is less flexible, it's less aware of nuance, it's less aware of subtlety. And I miss that nuance and subtlety which comes from discussing and examining a statement over a coffee, rather than following the rigid statement and seeing the news release. You miss the nods and winks. You miss that, rather than simply observing a virtual speech over the internet. But for this virtual speech over the internet, many thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was fantastic. And there's some real common themes there with some of the things that came up at our first seminar about just the essential nature of these private, off-the-record, informal conversations between parliamentarians, as well as between them and the media. It's challenging for everybody. Esther is also known, like Mark, as being one of our kind of primary parliamentary reporters. So I suspect we're going back to talk to a significant extent about Westminster with Esther. What would you add to what we've already heard?
Well, first of all, I'd echo completely what Mark and Brian have said about the reduced opportunity for spontaneous conversation and gossip. That's something we're all kind of getting to grips with, I think. Although something I have noticed, which doesn't totally make up for it, usually when I'm sitting down to write the Monday email on a Sunday night, I text a few different MPs or WhatsApp them to ask what they think about a certain thing that's happening tomorrow or that's prominent in the news. And I do find people are way quicker to respond than they used to be, possibly because they're a bit bored or feeling unloved by journalists. So that has kind of offset that, the lack of opportunity for casual conversation. But the thing I was going to add to that is that it's also meant a lack of spontaneity in the newsroom. I'm still working from home, although I hope that will change soon. But because the Times office, if any of you have ever been there, is basically a glorified porter cabin on top of the roof of Parliament. And there isn't really room to swing a cat, let alone socially distance. So we're very restricted in the number of people we can have in. And because we are working from home, there's less opportunity to kind of run things up the flagpole. So whereas before you would just pitch in and say, oh, I've had this, and then one of your colleagues might say, I've heard the same thing, and suddenly you have a story. You have to kind of make more of an effort to stay in touch in a more formal way, which I think is probably, which is quite frustrating, I think, in terms of how the newsroom would normally flow. And the time when it really struck me actually was when Boris Johnson was very ill and was rushed to hospital. And I just thought, if we were all in Westminster and talking to each other as normal, there's no way someone would have picked up on this or somehow heard how serious the situation was. But as things happened, it came as a total shock. And the other thing I wanted to say was, as Mark and Brian have both mentioned, the way Parliament functions during this time has itself become a huge story. And because that's my sort of main area that I cover is procedure, I've been writing kind of endless stories about the different efforts to try and keep Parliament up and running, and this enormous tension between the traditional ways that Parliament works, which is about kind of being close up with people, having a whispered conversation. So the traditions of Parliament, if you like, embodied in the person of Jacob Rees-Mogg, versus the safety measures we're all meant to be taking, which has led to digital innovations in Parliament that we were previously told would never be possible. So that's been the big tension and the big conversation which I've been covering. And there are some things, I think, some cats which have been let out of the bag, which will be difficult to stuff back in entirely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's been a really good start. And Alan, are we seeing questions come in? Because of course I can't see them. I'm inclined to ask a couple myself, but
we have no questions so far. So,
no questions, right? So get writing questions, people.
Everyone's been listening very, very intently. So yeah.
Well, that gives me great license as chair to start a conversation between these people on these fascinating points. Could I start with Mark? I was really interested to hear that you've only been into Westminster once. Of course, you know, we've touched a little bit on the controversies that there have been about the virtual hybrid parliament and the voting and so on. We know that Jacob Rees-Mogg has been very keen to bring the physical parliament back, and it is now in some form back in the Commons. Has that not changed anything? I mean, Esther might want to comment on this as well. I would have expected that there was a sort of phase 1 and a phase 2, but if you're still not in the building, is everything as it was from your point of view?
Well, it works in several different directions. I mean, I think no one wants to find themselves exposed to the virus. Everyone wants to be extremely careful, just for the reasons of their personal health. Now, and keeping in touch on the phone or by text or by WhatsApp or whatever may be more cumbersome, but it's what we've got at the moment. And so for that reason, yeah, we've all got family members and things like that we have to be wary of exposing to disease. So basically, it's not purely professional thing here, it's a personal thing as well. People are just being careful, and we're not being encouraged to go over there. And when you see interviews being recorded person to person, there's a microphone on a very long stick and everybody's trying to keep their distance. And working in radio, my experience is that you deal a lot with people over the phone. I recorded it in my first ever Zoom interview yesterday. I used all sorts of other things, FaceTime and Skype and whatever. I'm finding that in some ways people are sitting around and much easier to get when all they have to do is speak into their phone now. So in some ways it's both more cumbersome and less cumbersome to operate as a reporter during the system, but it's also scripted. And there's no wild card. And it all depends on who you pick up the phone to and who you talk to, rather than the random element of who you bump into.
I see that there are questions coming in now, but I'm seeing them because they're going to everyone. So if you are, I'm sure Alan will look at them, but because chat might get going amongst the audience, it would be helpful if you've got a question for the panel, if you could direct it to Alan Rennick to make sure that he picks it up. Esther, I don't know whether you want to come in on this point. I mean, it sounds like, in a sense, you know, a lot of MPs are now back. They're certainly sitting in bill committees. There are more of them in the chamber and so on. But from the journalist point of view, they might as well still not be there.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, so the Times usually has a couple of people in every day. Even so, those meetings with MPs will be distanced, which doesn't exactly make for the most secret of conversations. And yeah, so yeah, there is a bit of a mismatch there with possibly more MPs being back than journalists. And I think sadly there is a bit of an imbalance here, as there has been on the parliamentary side as well. So it means that people who are young, fit and healthy without childcare responsibilities will be the first ones to go back. And so it's not brilliant for representation either. But that said, I am hoping to go back after recess, if not before, because I miss my colleagues and I miss the office stuffed full with old newspapers.
That's a really interesting point about, we've heard quite a lot about representation amongst MPs, and I see that came up in one of the questions that went to everyone, but the representation amongst journalists is really important as well. Brian, can I ask you, I mean, starting with you, but again, it applies to Westminster just as much as to Scotland. You mentioned the press conferences, and I have sensed as a Parliament watcher myself, although not in a journalistic capacity, there's been quite a lot of sort of tension about the extent to which journalists have had access to the senior policymakers and parliamentarians haven't. Has there been a sense in Scotland, and do Mark and Esther feel that there's been a sense in London where sort of officially elected representatives are rather in contestation with journalists over access to who gets to ask the questions? You're on mute.
We got hers there.
You have to have at least one moment where somebody says to somebody else, "You're on mute." We've ticked that box now. That's fine.
I didn't mute myself. I understand entirely why I was muted, but I mean, I think Hollywood is perhaps less precious about its status than I understand entirely why the Palace of Westminster is quite precious about its status. I regard it as a precious being myself, having worked there for 6 years or so, and I know the affection with which the place is held, although there is contempt and contumely from others who regard it as a gentleman's club rather than being perhaps an experienced, an expert forum for political discourse. So there's less of that in Holyrood, but there is still nonetheless a growing sense of its own place and its own status, and they did feel usurped to some extent by the news conferences and by the media. And I think part of that was to try and get back in to that discourse. They also felt that they would take the discourse in a different direction from the media, who would focus upon, you know, one or two individual items, whereas a wide-ranging parliament would focus upon the concerns of opposition parties and then the concerns of backbenchers, which can be very different, the concerns of critics of the government, the concerns of supporters of the government. And so I think there has been a contest between the two. We have tried to strike a balance between covering that parliamentary discourse while transmitting the core information to people. I cannot get over that. I cannot stress that more than necessary. The hunger for information is positively startling, and we have tried to feed that hunger and satiate it as well.
That's great. That's Esther, go on. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Brian something. That is everyone in Holyrood kind of looking on at the mess in Westminster over voting in kind of absolute battle?
Yes, frankly, they quite deliberately brought in digital electronic voting, you know, push button voting in Holyrood, quite deliberately to be different from Westminster, not out of badness, not to try and show modern superiority, but simply because no one can understand why a system maintains like that takes so long. I understand, I appreciate the point about the gossip, you know, the opportunity for gossip in the lobby queues, but as Mark pointed out, it's rather difficult when the guy's 2 meters away from you and someone else is probably listening. But yes, it has been ridiculed, frankly, as being, you know, the largest car park apart from the M25 is the queue for the division lobbies.
Do either of you want to comment on this tension between the press conferences and Parliament in London? I mean, there was, you know, if you watch Twitter, you see quite a lot of criticism, quite a lot of it doubtless unfair, at the quality of questions coming from some of the journalists, and you feel that MPs are wanting to get in and ask the questions, but at the same time, Brian says some of those questions become very quickly politicised, so it's a difficult balancing act. Mark is unmuted. Is that a sign?
That's a sign. I think everybody's aware that, you know, when we eventually reach, as it were, the end of this period, there is going to be a substantial look back at who did what happened, whether the right decisions were taken, and that's making everybody very careful and very guarded right now. The people can see that end game will happen eventually, and it's already affecting behaviour. So, you know, people tiptoe through things. Things are very carefully phrased, and also I think, you know, quite as you say, journalists have this tension. They want to get the information out. They don't want to the kind of Westminster political gotcha that's the substance of the Socratic wonder that is lobby briefings. Just doesn't seem appropriate to an open public press conference, but people have to unlearn that habit. So I think that's been a factor in those press conferences as well.
Right. And Alan, may I ask one more? I don't know how you're doing there.
Doing very well. Lots of really interesting questions coming in. So we should move to them fairly quickly, but you go for it, Meg. And then
okay, well, just one more then, because I mean, this is an obvious fascination to me, and I think to both Mark and Esther. Esther said this thing about being kind of taken by surprise as to the extent to which Boris Johnson had been unwell. I just wonder how much else is taking you by surprise. I mean, I'm very struck that there's quite a lot of insurrection going on at Westminster at the moment. There's clearly quite a lot of unhappiness on the Conservative benches. There have been quite a lot of rebellions. And I wonder to what extent those have taken you by surprise, whether you knew they were coming and whether you think the whips knew they were coming. What effect has it had on the ability to sense dissent?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I wrote a piece about this last week. But yeah, there has been a real sense of kind of MPs drifting during lockdown and the normal channels not really operating as you would expect. And And it's not all to do with lockdown, so we also have to factor in that there's a massive intake of new MPs, and they're quite a maverick bunch. So they're not all kind of dyed-in-the-wool Tories. They're from a huge range of backgrounds. And yeah, when I was sort of talking to people about this, they were saying part of the problem is they haven't been able to go through the normal team building exercises that take place within Parliament. So the kind of receptions, the chats with ministers, that's all gone. They're starting to kind of ramp it up a bit more now. So they've offered kind of virtual chats with the Prime Minister, stuff like this for new MPs. But it has definitely been a problem, and it's something we've seen the whips trying to address, not just through the carrot, but also by the stick, with things like Theresa Villiers being blocked from the Intelligence and Security Committee. So yeah, I would say that is a very real problem, and some of the rebellions were expected. At the scale, for example, on the one about bullying and harassment, even though that was technically a free vote, but I don't think anyone really expected that scale of rebellion.
That's fascinating. The very useful reminder that it's not just that we entered this period in the middle of a parliament. We entered it very close to the beginning of a parliament, you know, when MPs were not settled in, and so that's definitely an added factor at Westminster, isn't it? Brian, I don't know whether you want to say anything extra on this, otherwise Alan is straining at the leash to get audience questions in.
Let's go for the audience, shall we?
Yeah, okay, over to Alan. What have you got?
So lots of really good questions. I don't think we're going to get to them all, so I'll focus on some questions that are close to our kind of theme, thinking about media reporting of politics. And I'll try grouping questions in groups of 3. So first group is going to be Rebecca McKee, Lisa James, and Anna Maria Coyan. And remember, so no one's indicated to me that you don't want to ask your question yourself. So I'll go over to those people and ask them to put their question. So remember, you're on mute. So if you just get ready to unmute yourself in order to ask your question, that would be great. So Rebecca McKee actually had a question that's quite closely related to what Esther was just saying in that last.
So we'll take all of the questions together and then go around the panel in turn. So Rebecca.
Great, hi. Yeah, my question was, let me just find where I put it again. Given the election was just only back in December, I wondered if you thought that there was in Westminster any longer term effects for this cohort of new MPs on how they interact with journalists, and whether you've missed opportunities you feel to build up relationships and kind of what that effect might be.
That's fascinating. I had a question that I didn't ask that might fit in with that, as to whether people are more coy on WhatsApp than they would be in a corridor, but maybe they'll be socialized not to be coy, this intake. Next we had Lisa, I think.
Yes, hi. My question is just picking up on the point about the workings of the Commons themselves being a huge story, as they have been during this period, and arguably in this period we've seen some of the issues around government control of the Commons in particular that also came out and were big flashpoints during Brexit. But one of the things that's always hindered Commons reform is this sense that nobody outside the Commons is really that interested. And I wondered, as a result of this, do you think it's likely that the lobby is going to become generally more interested in procedure, and that we'll see the lobby starting to give some more oxygen to stories like this in the future?
Thank you. And I've forgotten who the third one was. Alan.
Thirdly, we have Anna Maria Coyan.
Hello, good morning. My question was revolving the global news and how that's being reported. So my question was, are BBC News reporters travelling to other countries to report global news in Hong Kong or America? Or are we depending on other news outlets, or are we depending on BBC reporters already living there?
Wow, that's a fantastic broader question about the state of the media. Really, really interesting, the effect on international news. So we've got two which are very Westminster focused. Long-term impacts on the new intake, and maybe long-term impacts on the mindset of journalists and their attitudes towards procedure and their interest in procedure. And then the international question, which is a terrific one as well. Who would like to go first? Mark, you're the only one on mute, but you're indicating with your hand.
Yes, I'm now successfully unmuted. On the new MPs, yes, absolutely. I would be, trying to meet people, having cups of coffee, having conversations, getting to know them, and you just can't do that. And you're absolutely right. It's extraordinarily difficult to forge a relationship with someone you've only conversed with, probably in text or for a few moments on the phone somewhere. And you need a certain level of confidence. People need to feel that they can trust the person they're talking to, for example, observe when something's made off the record, and generally not go for sort of wild sort of gotcha interpretations of what they're trying to say to you. So that kind of thing takes a little time to build up. And there's an awful lot of people that I was sort of messaging and saying must have a chat, etc. And those chats have had to be postponed indefinitely now. And that's the sort of basic foundation of parliamentary news gathering, in a way, is just having that relationship with the people that you're trying to report, so you understand what they're interested in, what they're about, where they're coming from. So in due course, I dare say some of that will happen, and the latte industry will once again be rebooted by my consumption, but at the moment it's slightly so. On the procedural point, I think that the big driver of a lot of parliamentary procedural reform is the fact that people can now watch some of the sillier things taking place and think they're silly. I think that has changed the way, for example, that the Friday debates, which used to take place in virtual privacy and anonymity on private members' bills, and the weird sort of mannered talking out rituals that would be performed in those have changed, is simply because the public started watching them and thought sometimes this was a bit absurd and really rather a silly way to do business. I think the sight of MPs lining up for 45 minutes to vote on a single issue, and usually managing to make a hash of it in the early days and go down the wrong aisle or whatever, probably drove the move to speed things up and go to the procedure that they've got now, which seems to be a bit less time consuming. But even now, the sight of people queuing for miles through Westminster Hall and out across the Palace of Westminster, I think is something that makes MPs wince a bit, because it just looks so absurd, and it also seems to take an absurd amount of their time. So in due course, I think the simple optics of that will change it. The question about international reporting is a very good one, but I really can't speak to how reports are assigned. I'd be amazed if the BBC didn't have, for example, a fair number of resident people in Hong Kong, but I just don't really know how those things operate. So regretfully, I can't really comment very much on that.
We do have a very domestic politics focused trio of speakers. I don't know whether one of the other speakers would like to say something more on the international front, because it is a great question.
Not my zone, I'm afraid.
Brian's saying no.
Well, yeah, ditto with Mark. I'm sure the BBC does it all its best to cover with resident reporters and dispatch, but I'm not aware of the details and wouldn't like to intrude, I'm afraid.
Do you have any thoughts on the other questions, which were very Westminstery? And everybody doesn't have, obviously, to respond to all of the questions. That way we'll fit more in. But if you have any other thoughts.
I do. I mean, just talking about there was questions to some extent about the lobby system. And I recall in the 80s, when I was in Westminster, there was a substantial revolt against the media lobby system at that time, in which I was a young Tyro reporter. I joined. It petered out fairly quickly because you were cutting yourself off. If you're cutting yourself off from Downing Street news briefings, you were cutting yourself off then from a source of information that is now more readily available through formal news releases and formal briefings. But I think there's long been a misunderstanding in the public mind about the nature of the lobby system. It was presumed, I think, by many that there were these behind-the-hand, informal, perhaps deliberately misinformed statements given to the media, and that we swallowed it wholesale and then regurgitated them for public consumption. That is not the truth, and frankly never was the truth. We were always questioning the information that was coming from the official sources, whether it was the Prime Minister's official spokesperson, the Foreign Office, whatever, and we were always challenging it and testing it. And the way you do that is the system that Mark described so admirably, which is building up a series of contacts and a series of trusted contacts with others and testing the information against them before contrary to rumour, will you not come rushing out of Downing Street or rushing out of St Andrew's House and go straight on air with undiluted information unless we have checked it and tested it, even though it's come from a seemingly impeccable source. We test what is happening unless it's fairly straightforward announcements. And so I think there's something of a misapprehension of the lobby system. I remain still not a fan of it. I think that the news briefing should be on the record and, in my view, on camera as well. They should not be in a form that allows the individual putting forward the information to perhaps escape from it later. But nonetheless, it's not the case that journalists are simply compliant absorbers of information coming from the political system. We're not.
Thank you. Esther, did you want to come in? I mean, on the new MP point, Mark said they're not getting socialised with journalists. I'm struck they're not getting socialised with anybody, not with each other, not with their whips, not with their senior colleagues.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of really quick points on that. Yeah, one new MP said to me the other day that he felt like he was only just beginning to sort of get to grips with the Parliament and understand how it worked, and then they went into lockdown. So, I mean, he recognised this as a small complaint in the grand scheme of things, but it's definitely a factor for the new MPs, particularly some of them who aren't kind of like political animals, who find the whole thing quite bizarre. But and on the kind of reporting procedure point, I think we do have to maintain some self-awareness. So I'm always the one kind of trying to pitch procedural stories, and they're competing for space with real stories about, people's lives. And you're always, a story about the way the distance MPs keep apart in the chamber is always going to lose out to a story on schools, and that's probably correct. But I think the thing that does exercise and interest people is they really feel that MPs should be able to run their workplace as efficiently as everyone else. And that's the thing which seems to annoy people, that they can't seem to manage these things. And I do think, yes, there is a heightened interest in procedure, but I think really the game changer on that was Brexit and all the kind of vastly complicated votes and amendments and bits of arcane procedure that were being used to try and influence the outcomes there. So that kind of foundation had already been laid before this happened. And now, yes, you do have an elevated interest in the procedure, even if only because people are so baffled and confused by why they can't seem to get their house in order.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now we should go back to Alan for another batch, and unless we speed up, we're probably only going to get in 2 more batches. Well, let's see what the questions are, and maybe we could have slightly shorter answers, and maybe we could share them out between the panel a little bit more, but it depends what they are. Alan.
So batch 2 then. So I'm going to ask someone whose name comes up as M. Heron. I'm guessing that's my wonderful student, Maria Heron. And then we have the distinguished parliamentary scholar, Gavin Drewry, and then Kathryn Knox. So if those people can be ready to unmute themselves. And M. Heron, Maria, I'm guessing, is first.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, during COVID, there's been a much greater presence of regional papers and regional journalists on the national stage, especially at daily briefings, and sometimes asking some of the very best questions as well. But at the same time, unfortunately, regional politics shows such as Politics North and Inside Out, where I am in the Northeast, are on pause and are at risk of not returning. So I was just wondering what the panel think the lasting impacts of the COVID period will be for regional journalism.
Really interesting question. Thank you.
And Gavin Drewry is next.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, excuse me. When I open my Times and my Guardian, as I do most days, I first turn to John Crace and Quentin Letts. And I'm afraid, sorry, Esther, I often get no further, even though, as Alan has kindly said, I regard myself as a parliamentary scholar. I sometimes don't get to the more meaty reports. I wonder if this is just me being frivolous, but I have a serious question, which is, do reporters work with sketch writers in any way at all, maybe exchange ideas and probably jokes, or to keep a cordial professional distance?
Interesting. Thank you, Gavin. And Kathryn.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask the panel if you think journalists are actually doing enough to scrutinise and challenge government at this time. For instance, why isn't more being said about the fallout from Brexit, given the lack of progress on this and the massive implications it's got for the country and for our economy, particularly in the context of COVID already knocking back our economy massively. It does feel like there's been a bit of a news blackout beyond COVID for quite a long part of lockdown. So could you comment on what your thoughts are on that, please?
Terrific, thank you. So something from Gavin, which is very, very parliamentary, and then two other very broad questions really about journalism in this period. Brian, would you like to go first?
Yeah, indeed. Maybe on a couple of them. On the diarists, that was wonderful. I'm a huge admirer of parliamentary diarists and of parliamentary sketch writers and columnists who write droll stuff as well. I regularly assist with some of the more scurrilous diary material in Scotland. I recall a colleague, when I was in Westminster, I recall a colleague on one of the tabloid newspapers who was bemoaning to me that his editor was after more scandal, and he said, "It's all right, Brian, but the only scandals I know around here I'm involved in." So it was going to be something of a problem for him. So yes, there is interchange between the two. I think parliamentary diarists, dating back to the likes of Dickens, can be as advantageous as anything else. They can give us a great insight into the nature of the business. I really appreciate that question, and I worry about I'll just take the other one, the business of the media agenda. I am genuinely concerned about that. It is understandable. It is completely swamped. We are talking about, as Nicola Sturgeon described in different circumstances yesterday, we're talking about an illness that kills people and causes huge damage. It's going to be a little bit at the top of the news agenda, but you are right. There is a danger, a hazard, and a worry that other things slip through either unnoticed or mitigated. And I think the concern about Brexit is extremely well placed. We try and return to it regularly. There is a degree of consumer resistance, frankly, to anything that isn't explaining what's happening on the virus front. But we will try and cover Brexit. It is gigantically important and will be so in the future as well. It's a problem.
Thank you, Brian. It may be a slightly unfair question for two parliamentary reporters, but would one of you like to try and tackle the important question about the regional media?
Well, I'm an old Leicester Mercury hack, so I've been watching events in my former home city with absolute fascination, not least because the epicentre appears to be 2 streets down from where I used to live. And I do think it underlines the importance not just of regional newspapers, but local radio stations as well. And it's the kind of stuff that suddenly brings back into sharp relief just how vital those local lines of communication can be. So it may well be that one effect of this is to perhaps reboot the local media a bit. The problem with local media, frankly, at the moment is that its economic basis is being very badly squeezed. All the ads are going onto the internet. But there we go. I really do hope so, because I cut my teeth as a regional journalist and loved it. So here's fingers crossed. On the sketch writers, yeah. I've occasionally found myself sitting next to some of them, and you sort of gossip and whisper during the boring bits, and sometimes who's that over there? When some new member you're not quite familiar with perhaps an unusual haircut or something stands up, and you have to try and guess who they are. So that kind of thing. Yeah, there is a certain amount of collaboration between the solemn, serious gallery correspondents and the sketch writers, who have a lot more fun, I suspect, than we do. Brexit has become a second division issue at the moment. Frankly, the audience wants to know about COVID-19. The latest pronunciamento by Michel Barnier in a press conference in Brussels is neither here nor there to most of the audience, important though it unquestionably is, and we will doubtless come back to it. At the moment, though, you're talking to people about a subject they don't necessarily want to hear, which is always a hard act for any news medium.
Esther, I don't know whether you've got anything extra to add. We can go straight back to the questions.
Well,
if not.
seeing as we did mention the time sketch,
yeah,
I would say it's a shame I'm not seeing as much of Quentin anymore. But yes, we did used to talk about what was going on and what might be right for material, and I would, point out things to the diary as well.
They'd be mad not to come to you to sense check on procedure, really.
Well, and the Lords is always kind of underwatched, so that's first our hunting ground. On the point about regional media, completely agree with Mark. It's kind of underlined its importance. And I think, sadly, it's no secret that newspapers are suffering at the moment, and that will also be true of local papers. But I think the national papers have a role to play in maybe kind of deferring to local papers where they do have specialist knowledge of the situation. For example, we did a Red Box podcast where we interviewed a load of regional reporters from around the country about how things were playing out, and I found it one of the most rewarding ones we've done in lockdown. So that's maybe one way the two can interact.
That's a very nice plug for the Times Red Box podcast, which is excellent. Alan, what have you got for us?
So next round we have Kathryn Jaitly, who's asked two really interesting questions. So Kathryn, feel free to ask them both. They're both quite short, or pick one of them if you prefer. Matthew Taylor and Dave. Don't know Dave's surname, but Dave will be in this round as well. So Kathryn Jaitly.
Unless there are too many Daves out there, in which case they might all switch their microphones on at once. Kathryn.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So as a member of the general public with an interest in politics, firstly, I want to know what journalist opinions are about the daily briefings run by Westminster. And secondly, how do media organisations gauge which stories are of public interest at this time? Thanks.
Interesting, thank you. And in terms of the daily briefings, you're thinking that people might approve or disapprove of their existence or comment on their quality?
In my opinion, it felt quite farcical. But I'm sure other people will agree and disagree, especially those people of the public who got to ask their questions at the start of each briefing.
Yeah, the public involvement element was interesting, wasn't it? So Matthew Taylor, I think it was, wasn't it? Next. Matthew?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm sort of interested on the impact that remote working has had on you as journalists. So are you finding your own distance from the action means that you have a different, possibly even better perspective on the political scene, viewed through the filter of the net curtains of your home office?
Thank you. And the mysterious Dave.
Hello.
Hello.
It's me. Not that mysterious.
That Dave. Dave is our blog and newsletter editor.
Hello. Those who know me will know that I'm a big fan of Esther's, and so this is probably a question for Esther. But given the way that the Lords and the Commons have crossed paths procedurally, one going the other way whilst the other is going back to how it used to be, how has reporting on the Lords and the Commons differed, particularly with the fact that attendance in the Lords seems to be on the up now that people can phone in?
Okay, great, thank you. Why don't we start with Esther on this round? Take
Yeah.
that one and then whatever you fancy from the others.
So it's been interesting and not uncontroversial, the fact that more Lords are turning up virtually. On the one hand, I can see how there are some advantages because it means that peers who maybe have health conditions or who are particularly elderly can protect themselves and participate more freely. On the other hand, there is some evidence which has been acknowledged by the whips that more people are sort of clocking in because it's easier to do so from home and get an allowance, which is a smaller allowance, but an allowance nonetheless. So that's been reported on. But yeah, I mean, I think the Lord Speaker has been very proactive and kind of embraced the digital system, perhaps more so than his counterpart in the Commons. And, you know, we focus on the things that go wrong, but overall, you do have to pay tribute to the digital services who've made things run in both houses with really no notice at all. It's really impressive in both the Commons and the Lords. I was also going to address the question about the daily briefings, if you want me to. It's really interesting because I wrote the Red Box email, so little plug for the email there, please sign up if you're not already. We get lots of feedback from readers and we do feel this real sense that people think journalists aren't asking the right questions. And we do get a small number of the counter view, which is that everyone's just trying to trash the government and we're all being really negative and horrible. So when we get criticism from both sides, then we think we're probably doing something right. And I think my main reply to that would be, if you watch the journalists who questioned Dominic Cummings after his particular adventure, I don't think anyone could accuse them of soft-soaping. I think that was a thorough going over, and like everyone else in this weird situation, we're sort of trying to do our best.
Thank you very much. Brian, we've got, what impact has this situation had on you and your ability to get perspective while sitting in your living room? And then we've got the question of the impact on the agenda, who decides on the agenda, and the daily briefings.
I'm going to try and blend those two together if I can, because they are both fascinating questions. The agenda is a difficult one. We have to keep ourselves constantly on guard to avoid being a political insider. We are not political insiders. We're not part of Westminster. We're not part of Holyrood. We're not part of the political system. We are there to stir up trouble and ask awkward questions on behalf of the public who don't have the opportunity that is granted to us to do so. And we should remember that all the time. I recall from my very earliest days as a Westminster lobby corps being enormously impressed for a brief period by people who turned up at news conferences at the Department of Energy or the Foreign Office or whatever. And they would ask this long, intense question about the homologation of some policy that had been forwarded by the subcommittee on whatever, and then they would get an equally long, tedious answer from the minister. And I thought, God, that's good stuff. And then I appreciated actually nothing had been learned whatsoever, literally nothing. It was an exercise in mutual back-scratching between a minister and a journalistic sycophant, and made no difference whatsoever to the public interest. What you should do is ask the sort of questions that the late, great Tam Diel used to ask. He asked long, tedious ones as well, but occasionally he would stand up and say, why? How much? When? And that's the sort of questions we should be asking as journalists, and we should remember we're asking them in terms of the things that matter to the people. We try in the BBC to ask, to get the sort of question we ask, interrogate the agenda we're doing in terms of our audience. Why does this matter to our audience? Not why does it matter to the participants and the politicians, but why does it matter to the people we are serving? And if you try and ask that question, then you solve the admittedly huge conundrum that excellent question asked about the media agenda. As to being at a distance from the coverage, I think it makes a difference. There is a pack mentality in journalism that one has to guard against. You have to guard against pursuing the agenda that your colleagues and your counterparts are pursuing. And if when you are slightly remote, it makes that frankly easier.
Thank you, Brian. And Mark?
Very little to add to that, because I think my esteemed colleagues have said exactly what I was going to say about all of it. The only thought I have is really covering from a distance is very strange, and I'm not sure I fully or at all figured out how to maintain perspective. All you've got is the stuff that's feeding into you, which is the feeds of Parliament, the feeds of the press conference, looking at social media, and it's very dangerous to assume that social media reflects the genuine mood of the public. But sometimes it's all that's there, and so you have to kind of try and come to some kind of rolling average of what you're seeing, and hope that you don't stray too far out into the wilds in that process. But there really is a feeling of flying blind about a lot of this.
And that goes back to the WhatsApp point, I think, doesn't it? That somebody might lean over to you in a corridor and say, do you know what, there's something really big going on that ought to be reported. Whereas now maybe some of them would send you a WhatsApp message, and maybe some of them wouldn't want anything that could be screenshotted and potentially shared.
Precisely.
Yeah, and I think there's the persistent danger of over-reliance on Twitter. So when Parliament was going back, or we heard they were going to go back, I had a conversation with an MP who said she kept seeing this meme on Facebook that was sort of spreading like wildfire, but we had no idea because it was on Facebook, of a picture of the House of Commons full for PMQs saying, when the House of Commons looks like this, that's when we'll send our children back to school. So these kind of conversations going on that maybe we're not tapping into enough. Although I think the counterpoint is, one thing about virus is it affects everyone in some way. So I think as journalists, we will still know people who are being affected, and that's something that those kinds of experiences that we're hearing about from people we know are something that feeds into our awareness as well.
Thank you. Now, we're beginning to fight with time here because we must finish at 12:15, but those of you who are here at the beginning will have heard me say that this conversation was slightly inspired by an excellent blog post by somebody called Greg Power about informal politics. And I gather that Greg Power has a question. I don't know whether I go via Alan or straight to Greg. Is Greg out there? Would he like to ask his question?
Hello. Yes.
Hello.
I'm here. I wasn't expecting you.
Greg was a speaker at the last seminar, I should have said as well.
Yes. Well, I mean, the question sort of followed from what Mark had said about the sheer tonnage of news coming out of Westminster. And I wondered, this is more about the politics than it is about the reporting, but I just wondered what the panel were thinking about how well the politicians themselves are adapting to this volume of stuff that they have to deal with, and the new context within which they have to deal with it. We've talked about problems of party management on both sides. And added to that, who is adapting to this? Are politicians starting to see new ways of exploiting the opportunities created by these new procedures? And who benefits more in the long run? There's an assumption that the government is probably benefiting more from this because of their control. But I'm just wondering, in terms of that party management, that some of the issues that were discussed earlier, whether the opposition has the potential to to fight a few more guerrilla raids on the government in the current context.
Really interesting question. Is there a Scottish perspective on this, Brian?
Scottish and UK, perhaps. The opposition make a role for themselves when they ask intelligent, challenging, searching questions about things that are really of interest to people. Mostly the here today, gone tomorrow, he said, she retorted stuff washes entirely rightly over the public who are concerned about their employment, their school kids' education, their health, etc. When you get to a thing like this, the virus, it reminds me of nothing so much as in 2014 in Scotland when we had the independence referendum. There was an incredible focus upon the choice that confronted people. There was vast public interest in all aspects of the question, and we were feeding that interest and being involved in the discourse. It resulted, of course, in a huge turnout in the referendum. This is comparable. There is massive interest, and I think that does tend, both in Scotland and in the UK government, to lay stress upon government pronouncements, because the opposition are saying the governments are doing, and what they are doing is of enormous interest to people. Where the opposition can engage, and they are doing so in both Holyrood and Westminster, is when they take the particular agenda, rather than ridiculing everything that ministers are doing, when they take the precise agenda and pick points, but they have to be in keeping with the sort of questions that people in the audience would be asking. They'd be saying, yeah, but hang on a second, how's that going to work in practice? You know, how's that going to work? How's the Leicester lockdown going to work in practice when half a street is closed? How's the implementation of quarantine going to matter in practice when the police say, as they did in Scotland, that they wouldn't be inclined to pursue it this sort as a matter for the border guards? So it's that, as long as they're asking those sort of questions, then the opposition are doing a very real role indeed, and they are engaging genuinely in the discourse in the interests of the people rather than in partisan interests.
It does sound like what Keir Starmer is trying to do to me.
Very much trying to do. And Ian Blackford, MP in
yes. Mark and Esther, is this benefiting Keir Starmer, Boris Johnson, or the insurgent backbenchers?
Too soon to say at the moment, but you can see them both.
That's a very academic answer.
I'm afraid it is a very academic answer, but there's no way of telling, how far the particular approach is being taken or working. If you watch yesterday's Prime Minister's question time, you have Keir Starmer asking those questions of detail as Brian described, and at the same time you have Boris Johnson coming back and saying, we're the doers, they're the ditherers. So you can see people testing their approaches and trying to get it out there and trying to produce that little bit of parliamentary theatre that people do actually register without it becoming frivolous or insanely oppositional or anything like that. So that's a game in process at the moment, and it's a game of, well, more than two halves. So we shall have to see how it unfolds. What I think is also interesting watching it is the role of insurgent backbenchers in this. The Conservative benches have a large number now of sort of heavyweight ex-ministers, the David Davises, the Greg Clarks, people like that, the Jeremy Hunts in particular, lurking on the backbenches now, who have things to say and views to push, and are not going to go away. And I think one of the hallmarks one of the vulnerabilities, if you like, for the government is when one of those people finds themselves at the head of something that begins to cause the government real trouble, some amendment to legislation, some question to a minister, because I think that where the government could be in danger is when some of its own side, and they are a bit of a loose confederation at the moment, some of its own side are not on board for something, that's when the problems will occur.
David Davis has been interesting. Esther, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think I think that's right what Mark said about the position the government finds itself in. I think Keir Starmer has had some advantages in that he's kind of had a dry run at PMQs for the past few weeks. He's operating in this kind of quiet environment within the chamber. I think the unfortunate thing for Labour has been that one of the areas the government is seen as having really mismanaged, and that's schools, hasn't been Labour's strongest hand either. So they haven't really been able to land too many blows. But I think Boris Johnson has struggled in recent weeks to maintain discipline and to impose authority. That could mean we're in for some sort of crackdown next. And I think in terms of how politicians are adapting, I think it's worth just mentioning that MPs have been dealing with a vast amount of casework, and their workload has changed and become very much oriented towards coronavirus. And in a way that is probably a good thing, because it means the problems which are coming down the road with unemployment are going to be things that MPs are already very involved with through their constituents. So that's just something worth remembering.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time. We're 1 minute over time. So I think it just remains for me to say thank you to our terrific panel. One of the things that we commented on at the last seminar